Well, I've only been eating beef fundamentally, for almost 5 years now. I never imagined in my wildest dreams, number one, that you could just live on meat, and number two, that it would have such a salutary effect. So for me, I lost 52 pounds in 7 months. I went from 212 pounds to 165, which is exactly what I weighed when I was 23. And I've maintained that weight since. I can put on muscle mass with no problem, even though I'm 62. I had a host of inflammatory conditions, some of which were quite serious, including peripheral uveitis, which sometimes blinds people, in my right eye, and it disappeared completely, along with psoriasis and gastric reflux disorder, and interestingly enough, gum disease, which is technically incurable, which is linked to cardiovascular degeneration, and which has gone away 100% in my case, according to multiple measures that my dentists have taken. And so when I've talked to many people who've lost like 100 pounds in a year, because they come to my talks, and who are just beside themselves, so to speak, as a consequence of experimenting with this diet. The food pyramid was actually produced not by scientists or by MDs, although there were some MDs who were consulting, who were mostly ignored, but by the Department of Agriculture. And it was a marketing scheme, essentially. And that the consequence of the marketing scheme was that people were enticed and convinced to rely primarily on carbohydrates for their nutritional necessities, and perhaps carbohydrates at far too excess a level. Now, carbohydrates are transmuted into glucose during metabolism, and we eat way more carbohydrates than we need to produce the amount of glucose that we need. Now, people have been getting fatter in a catastrophic way for about 4 or 5 decades, and that's really in no small part since the introduction of the food pyramid. Now, I do understand that part of the reason the Department of Agriculture did this was because carbohydrates, and this was particularly true of corn syrup, do provide a very inexpensive source of calories. And if you're dirt poor and you don't have enough to eat, just getting enough calories, period, is of vital importance. Not everybody can afford steak, for example, or more expensive foods of that type, but virtually everyone, poor or not, in the West can afford basic carbohydrates. Having said that, I also have read, and I think it's valid, that there was early evidence that this heavy carbohydrate-loaded diet that was being prescribed was going to increase obesity and diabetes, which it's done at a level that makes the pandemic epidemic look like absolutely nothing. And this is still being pushed forward by people who are hypothetically on the nutritional front. As you may or may not know, my daughter was very ill with a plethora of immunological problems, including very serious juvenile arthritis. And it just about killed her. It did destroy 2 of her joints, and she had another 38 that were affected. And so she was always in a lot of pain. And I looked into the role that diet played in arthritis through the scientific literature for a couple of years and found 2 things, and they were somewhat contradictory. And one was that there was no real evidence that any specific elements of diet had been linked to juvenile arthritis specifically. But, and this was a major but, if people who were arthritic fasted completely, then their arthritic symptoms often disappeared. And so I thought that had something to do with the consequences of fasting. But then my daughter started to play, and my wife as well, very intensely with the diet. We went to a nutritionist who recommended an elimination diet at one point because we did notice that she would react to strawberries and oranges. And within a day, her thumbs would swell or her toes would swell. And so we knew there were some things she was eating. We had her tested for immunological reaction to food, but when we tested her, she showed a hyperreaction to virtually everything they tested her for. And we concluded at that point, well, there's no damn way she could be reacting to everything she's eating. Well, she went on this elimination diet and showed a bit of reduction in symptom, but the elimination diet made no sense. Like, there was no rhyme or reason to what you could eat and what you couldn't eat. And so she started to experiment with more restricted diets and eventually discovered that if she only ate beef, and it turns out for her it has to be beef that isn't aged, then all of her immunological symptoms disappeared. And then my wife and I started playing with that diet. And so I've only been eating beef fundamentally, for almost 5 years now. And I eat a lot of meat and a lot of high fat meat. And so I'm never hungry. And I don't think that I'm calorie restricted at all because, I can eat a tomahawk steak sometimes in one sitting, which is about 35 ounces of meat. I never get hungry. And I eat high fat carnivore snacks too. The diet has actually been rejuvenating for my wife and I. Like, its effect on muscle tone has to be seen to be believed. And that's true even though both of us are 60. Like, my wife is in better shape from a musculature perspective now at 63 than she was when she was 40. And she was a very physically fit person who was exercising constantly and who was in pretty damn good shape. And to see that reverse rather than just, stop deteriorating, I don't really know what to make of it. The reason that beef works and that other ruminant animals, bison, so forth, lamb, goat, is because they process what they eat through so many stomachs that by the time it is actually turned into meat, there's pretty much nothing else there. So it's a very purified form of nutritional, very purified form of food. Now, like I said, that's anecdotal, and this is partly why I don't talk about it. But I can tell you, after you've talked to 1,000 people who tell you the same anecdote, you don't have an anecdote anymore. You have a hypothesis. And it's really quite something seeing these people who show me pictures of what they looked like a year ago. And, they were carrying around an extra person with them. And they're still shell-shocked by the transformation, because it's really something to lose, say, 150 pounds in a year. The advantage, too, of the diet, the carnivore diet in particular, is because you can eat as much as you want. It's actually not a diet. The problem with diets is that they require privation and they require almost continual privation. And then they also tend to produce a yo-yo effect. And that's partly because if you get in a fight with your hypothalamus, which drives hunger, you're going to lose because it's there to make damn sure you don't starve. And the probability that you can override it for any length of time, well, it's very, very low. And that probably varies from person to person for all sorts of reasons. But you don't want to get in a scrap with your lower level motivational systems. Now, if I ever start to crave a banana split, for example, I can just eat another 5 or 6 ounces of steak and then I don't care. It's not like it wouldn't taste good, but it doesn't preoccupy me the way it would if I was hungry. I've really noticed this when I go into grocery stores, because if I go into a grocery store after having consumed enough meat, then the provision of this infinite display of delicious foods really doesn't affect me much. But boy, if I ever go into a grocery store when I'm hungry, that's quite the pain in the neck because everything's delightful and tempting, So the fact that you can eat enough or even as much as you want on a keto or carnivore diet does seem to distinguish it in some ways from the diets that depend more particularly on mere calorie restriction. I noticed that as I got older, my ability to concentrate when I was reading was deteriorating. So when I was 25, 30, if I picked up a book and read it, I would shut everything else out and I would concentrate on, focus on, attend to what I was reading, read every word and understand it with no problem. But that started to deteriorate as I got older. And I noticed that it took an increasing amount of effort to shut everything off. And that instead of reading as deeply as I was sort of glancing at the words. And when I started this carnivore diet, that reversed. And I can now, I actually think this is true. I think I can read faster and more efficiently than I could when I was in my 20s. And I was pretty good at it when I was in my 20s. And so the other thing that I've noticed too is that I don't have periods of time. This was quite a problem for me, and it might have had something to do with my immunological problems, is that I would get hypoglycemic and lose the ability to concentrate and get, what do they call it, hangry, hungry and angry and irritable. And that would happen several times a day, probably because I was working too much. But in any case, that is gone completely. And I really don't miss it. I wake up in the morning with a stable mood, and my mood doesn't vary much throughout the day. I'm also much more stress tolerant and able to bounce back from stressors faster. And in terms of endurance, there were lots of times over the last 3 years when I was walking 9 to 12 miles a day on a carnivore diet. Now, I wasn't running, but my experience is that I'm stronger and I have more stamina than I did 10 years ago. And that's quite something, given that I'm now 62.